Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world where the glow of a forge was one of the few reliable sources of light, and where the people standing next to that glow spent most of their lives coated in soot. So, settle in. Pull a blanket around your shoulders if you have one handy. Maybe keep a glass of water nearby. Blacksmithing, as we're about to find out, was an occupation that made you thirsty just by thinking about it. Blacksmiths were the quiet backbone of medieval towns, though not necessarily the glamorous sort of backbone. They made the nails, hinges, locks, plowshares, and of course, weapons that everyone depended on. Without them, there would have been no swords for heroic knights, no iron pots for bubbling stews, no hinges for doors that creaked ominously in all those gloomy castles. Yet for all this civic importance, their lives were, frankly, exhausting. The forge demanded heat, and the heat demanded stamina. The air shimmered with sparks, and the smell of burning charcoal. You'd stand there for hours, muscles aching, coaxing stubborn metal into shape while a bellows-wielding apprentice fanned the flames. And naturally, this was done in heavy leather aprons that trapped every drop of sweat you produced. Their workday didn't stop with daylight either. If a plowshare snapped during spring planting, or someone bent the iron fittings on a cartwheel, the smith was expected to fix it immediately, regardless of whether it was dinner time, or, worse, after curfew when the town watch preferred everyone to be asleep. To add insult to injury, most smithies were located near stables or tanneries. So, in addition to the metallic tang of iron and smoke, you got the faint but persistent bouquet of manure wafting through your workspace. Medieval zoning laws were creative, and then there were the burns. No matter how cautious you were, hot metal had a talent for finding skin. Gloves helped a little, but not much. They became stiff and brittle after a few weeks. Some smiths developed impressive calluses, others a collection of tiny scars like a personal constellation map. Except this one told stories like the day I dropped the horseshoe, or that time the apprentice sneezed into the coals. Despite all this, blacksmiths held a middling social rank, somewhere between respected artisan and person everyone blames when the gate latch breaks. Their wages varied wildly. A castle-employed smith might live in a modest stone house with a little yard, while a village smith often worked from a lean-to attached to his cottage, trying to keep rain off the anvil with a roof that leaked anyway. Guilds offered some protection, but also paperwork, fees, and occasional lectures about keeping proper measurements on hinges. Medieval bureaucracy rarely missed an opportunity. One might hope the hard labor at least guaranteed fame or romance. Sadly, not often. Chroniclers tended to save their ink for kings, saints, or unusually dramatic goats. A few smiths crept into folklore. There's Wayland the Smith from Norse and English legends, but his story involves betrayal, maiming, and a set of swan wings, so perhaps not the advertisement the profession wanted. Still, there were moments of pride. A well-balanced sword or an intricate lock could earn admiration. Some smiths secretly etched tiny marks on their creations, a private signature hidden under layers of polish or paint. Others competed to craft the lightest yet strongest horseshoes, because medieval people loved a contest even if it involved hooves and iron. Let's drift from the clang of hammer on anvil to another corner of the Middle Ages, one with fewer sparks but more questionable decision-making. Royal wardrobes. Clothing for monarchs was an arms race in fabric form. Velvet, silk, ermine. If it shimmered or came from a dangerously faraway place, someone at court wanted it. Henry VIII famously spent small fortunes on outfits, sometimes changing several times a day, just to remind everyone he could. His tailors must have had the stamina of professional athletes, plus nerves of steel, given that one bad scene could offend a man prone to beheading friends. Queens were no better. Isabella of Portugal once owned a dress so heavily embroidered with pearls that wearing it reportedly required 2 attendants to help her stand up straight. Sumptuous, yes, but also a bit like being hugged by an overenthusiastic oyster. Meanwhile, servants handled the laundering, or more often, the peruming of royal garments. Washing was rare. Linen undershirts absorbed sweat and were changed frequently, but outer layers might only see water a few times a year. Courtiers sprinkled herbs into folds or stored clothes with cedar to discourage moths, and, presumably, everyone else. Speaking of herbs, they weren't just for wardrobes. Medieval kitchens leaned heavily on them to disguise the taste of meat that had been a little too optimistic about its shelf life. Cooks mixed sage, parsley, and garlic with vinegar or wine, producing sauces that were either delicious or alarming depending on your tolerance for medieval fermentation. Back at the forge, our patient blacksmith probably envied cooks for working indoors with a roof over their heads. Rain could douse the fire. Wind might scatter sparks into a neighbor's haystack, and snow made tools painfully cold. Yet the work persisted, because life without iron was unthinkable. Even wealthy abbots needed door hinges, and knights needed stirrups for their elaborate charges at tournaments. And of course, someone had to repair all the bent lances when tournaments ended as badly as they often did. Let's pause on that thought. Tournaments. Picture them less as elegant ballets of chivalry and more as controlled chaos involving splintered wood, bruised egos, and the occasional dental rearrangement. Smiths repaired helmets after those contests, straightening dented visors while knights pretended they hadn't been terrified under all the bravado. Every tool the smith made had its own story. The plow that helped a farmer survive winter, the lock protecting a merchant's ledger, the cauldron simmering an experimental stew. Even the humble nail was essential. Castles consumed thousands, driven into everything from roof beams to drawbridges. Somewhere, a harried smith was counting them, sighing at yet another noble demanding a bigger chest, with extra nails, for security. And then there's the matter of payment. Coins were common, but sometimes clients paid in chickens, ale, or promises. A smith might shoe a horse in exchange for a side of bacon or sharpen sickles in return for a seat at a harvest feast. Romantic as barter sounds, it often resulted in cupboards full of turnips when what you needed was cash for charcoal. Charcoal itself required planning. Large quantities came from managed woodlands, where colliers slowly burned logs under earth mounds to produce the dense black fuel. Without it, forges were useless. So, smiths maintained cordial relations with colliers, or at least avoided insulting them, which was wise given the colliers' tendency to carry axes. By now, you might be picturing a soot-streaked figure wiping sweat from his brow, hammer poised over glowing iron. That's fair, though we should also remember blacksmiths sometimes doubled as informal dentists or surgeons. Their tools were sturdy, their hands steady, and villagers often assumed this qualified them for tooth extractions or removing wayward splinters. Medieval occupational boundaries were flexible, all of which leads us to a quiet truth. The medieval blacksmith's life was essential, underappreciated, and physically relentless. But without them, entire societies would have rusted into stillness. Every clang of iron was a small promise that doors would open, carts would roll, and someone's ambitious stew would stay on the fire. Take a moment to breathe and imagine the soft hush after a long day in the smithy. Coals fading to orange, the last horseshoe cooling on a bench, a mug of ale waiting near a wooden stool. Not glamorous, but steady and in its way, comforting. And on that slightly smoky note, let's drift toward another curiosity from the same era. The rather eccentric habits of royal pets who often had more comfortable lives than the people feeding them. So, let's drift over from the clang of the forge to something far softer. The menagerie of pets that lounged around medieval palaces. If you were lucky enough to be born royal, you could surround yourself with almost any creature that caught your fancy. And many of them did. Cats, dogs, falcons, monkeys, parrots. All lived pampered lives in chambers that most subjects would have given anything just to glimpse. Richard II of England, for instance, had a greyhound named Math that supposedly never left his side. Math was treated like a small, furry dignitary, reportedly given permission to wander Parliament Hall. One wonders how lawmakers felt about paws on polished floors while they argued over taxes. Monkeys were a court favorite as well. They offered a blend of entertainment and chaos that royals apparently found irresistible. Catherine de Medici owned several, all dressed in miniature garments. There's a record of one escaping during a banquet, scattering bread rolls and terrifying a visiting ambassador. No word on how the ambassador felt about his diplomatic dignity afterward. Then there were the birds. Falcons were practically status symbols, strapped to noble wrists and taken hunting. Some kings, like Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, became so fascinated with them that they wrote treatises on falconry. Frederick's book is surprisingly scientific, careful notes on breeding, feeding, and training, though it also implies a man who preferred avian company to most humans. Of course, not every royal pet was graceful. Charles VI of France, sometimes called Charles the Mad, reportedly kept a stable of enormous hunting dogs, but also allowed smaller lapdogs to scurry under his table during meals. One contemporary noted that dinner with Charles often meant dodging an undercurrent of fur and tails. Pets occasionally caused more than awkward moments. A parrot belonging to Queen Elizabeth I is said to have interrupted council meetings by shrieking at inopportune times, though this might be apocryphal. Still, parrots were notorious for repeating things they shouldn't, which must have made them risky confidants for anyone with state secrets. Beyond pets, court life brimmed with eccentricity. Royals rarely traveled without an entourage the size of a small village. Every journey required cooks, cupbearers, tailors, jesters, scribes, and the occasional alchemist, because apparently you never knew when you'd need someone to attempt turning lead into gold mid-trip. Inside the palace, rituals piled upon rituals. A monarch's morning might involve an audience with their barber, who not only trimmed hair, but sometimes offered unsolicited advice about politics. Then came a procession of attendants presenting basins of water for hand washing, layers of garments to be arranged just so, and finally, the delivery of breakfast, often a hefty affair involving roasted meats. Despite the early hour, Court etiquette demanded silence or murmured conversation while meals were served. Cutlery varied. Spoons were common, knives personal, forks still an exotic novelty in much of Europe. People tore bread into bite-sized pieces, and trenchers, slabs of stale bread, doubled as plates. These edible plates soaked up sauces, though one imagines they also soaked up anything else the table offered, which could be less appetizing. Once fortified, kings and queens moved on to petitions, judgments, and diplomatic audiences. Foreign envoys arrived bearing gifts, tapestries, jars of honey, ornate clocks that rarely kept correct time. The more impractical the present, the more certain it would find favor. Meanwhile, courtiers hovered nearby, hoping for promotions or failing that gossip. Gossip was the lifeblood of any court. Who was falling out of favor, who had a suspiciously expensive new cloak, whose cousin had been caught stealing the royal candlesticks. All these tidbits circulated in whispers as steady as the tap of rain against stained glass. Every so often, a royal household decided to host an event of truly staggering pointlessness. Banquets with sculpted sugar animals were popular. Guests were encouraged to admire them before, inevitably, someone snapped off a sugar hoof to nibble. Pageants involved costumed courtiers performing allegorical plays, often with morals so obscured that no one dared admit confusion. And tournaments, though meant to display knightly valor, often devolved into bruised egos and dented armor, as we noted earlier. Even beyond Europe, rulers cultivated similarly theatrical courts. In Baghdad's Abbasid palaces, musicians entertained caliphs with delicate melodies while scholars debated astronomy over cups of fragrant coffee-like brews. In China, Song dynasty emperors sponsored intricate tea ceremonies and poetry contests. Though bureaucracy there could rival any Western court in its ability to smother enthusiasm under paperwork. But royalty wasn't all pageantry and comfortable cushions. Their personal lives were often tangled webs of alliances, jealousies, and inconvenient relatives. Take poor Joanna of Castile, later nicknamed the Mad. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome began with genuine affection but deteriorated as Philip pursued an energetic social life that didn't always include his wife. Joanna responded with bouts of jealousy and erratic behavior, though some historians suspect her reputation was exaggerated by men eager to sideline her political claims. Or consider Charles II of Spain, whose unfortunate genetics left him frail and plagued by ailments. He struggled with speech and coordination, yet was burdened with ruling an empire. His counselors, meanwhile, argued over whether sorcery or poor breeding caused his troubles, which was both unhelpful and a little unfair. These cautionary tales remind us that dynasties often prized good matches over sensible genetics. Marriages were tools, and if a bride happened to be her groom's cousin several times over, well, that was politics. The results could be alarming. Portraits of certain Habsburgs showed chins so prominent they looked capable of minor architectural support. Back in the humbler corners of the realm, blacksmiths, millers, and weavers continued their steady labor, unaffected, at least directly, by royal melodrama. Yet they felt its consequences when taxes rose to fund another palace wing, or when new coinage required yet another trip to the smith for resizing tools. Monarchs rarely considered how their whims rippled outward, but the ripples were there, nudging everyday lives like stones tossed into a still pond. Another subject worth drifting toward is food. Not banquets this time, but the ordinary meals that kept people alive. Bread dominated the diet, ranging from fine white loaves for elites to dense rye or barley breads for peasants. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, was the reliable fallback. Meat was a treat for commoners, though more frequent for the well-off. Fish, salted or fresh, appeared everywhere, thanks to religious fasting rules that turned Fridays into seafood appreciation days. Ale was safer than water in many towns, since brewing killed off harmful microbes. Monks produced excellent beer, and some households made weak small beer for children. Wine flowed generously in southern regions, while northern tables welcomed cider or mead. It's likely most people went through life slightly buzzed, which perhaps explains the patience required for medieval bureaucracy. Speaking of brewing, early records show that women, known as alewives, dominated beer making before large-scale commercial brewing emerged. They often worked from home, hanging a broom or a sprig of ivy above the door to signal fresh batches. Over time, regulations and guilds edged them out, but traces of their trade linger in folklore about witches. Cauldrons, cats, tall hats, and broomsticks all had roots in ale-making gear. Nightfall brought its own rhythms. Candles flickered in chambers, and city gates shut to discourage wandering thieves, or wandering anyone, really. Wealthier homes might enjoy tapestries for warmth, while villagers settled near hearths, children dozing in shared beds. Without street lamps, darkness arrived thick and absolute, encouraging early sleep or, occasionally, storytelling sessions full of saints, dragons, or mildly scandalous neighbors. Above all, life moved more slowly. Messages traveled by horse or foot, meaning news could take days or weeks. A royal decree issued in London might not reach a northern shire until after its relevance had expired. This unhurried pace frustrated ambitious courtiers, but probably helped everyone else manage expectations. As we near the end of this part, picture a quiet evening in a medieval town. The forge is dark, shutters closed against the wind. From a nearby tavern drifts the soft murmur of voices and the faint tang of ale. Somewhere in a castle, a pampered hound curls beside a roaring hearth while courtiers debate whether a recent comet is an omen or just an especially bright rock. History, viewed from a distance, has a way of flattening drama into calm shapes. The people we've wandered past, blacksmiths, kings, queens, falconers, alewives, were tangled in their own worries and ambitions. But tonight, we can let them settle quietly into the background. Their world may have been smoky, drafty, and occasionally absurd, yet it holds a sort of drowsy charm when approached at bedtime speed. Let's pause here, letting the last candle gutter out in our imagination. When we pick up again, we'll wander further into the curious business of medieval brewing, a story with its own mix of ingenuity, superstition, and slightly sour barrels. Hey everyone, settle in again. Maybe stretch your toes under the blanket, or let your shoulders sink a bit deeper into the pillow. Tonight, we're picking up where we left off, with the clink of mugs and the faint, toasty scent of malt. Brewing has been with humanity for as long as we've had both grain and the patience to let it sit in water until something happened. By the Middle Ages, beer was less a recreational beverage and more a mild, liquid bread, a steady companion that was safer than many wells. Water, left to its own devices, was a gambling game of questionable clarity. Beer, on the other hand, rewarded you with bubbles and, if you were lucky, a sense of calm detachment from the week's tax announcements. Monasteries were the Michelin star breweries of their age. Benedictine monks, Cistercians, Trappists, they all kept careful notes about mash times and hop additions. Some monasteries still do. Their cellars smelled faintly of baked grain, and the hum of fermenting vats gave cloisters a surprisingly domestic soundtrack. One can picture a patient brother, sleeves rolled up, stirring a cauldron while pondering the finer points of theology, or perhaps just wondering why Brother Martin always sampled more than his share. Outside the monastery walls, beer was often made by women, the alewives we brushed against in part 2. They'd boil wort over an open hearth, straining it through cloth before cooling it in wide wooden tubs. Sometimes a stray cat inspected the work, allegedly protecting the batch from mice. The tall, pointed hat that later became a cartoonish witch's accessory was just practical, easier to spot the brewer at a busy market. That broomstick over the door? It signaled fresh ale inside, not aerial transport. Hops, now inseparable from beer, weren't always part of the recipe. Early European brews leaned on gripe, an herb blend of whatever was nearby: yarrow, bog myrtle, heather. Each village had its own combination, which meant every pint could taste slightly different, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Hops gained ground around the 12th century because they preserved beer longer and gave that pleasantly bitter edge. Some traditionalists grumbled, of course. Change rarely escapes complaint, but by the late Middle Ages, hopped beer was the clear favorite, despite mutterings that it made people melancholic. More likely, it made them aware of how many errands they'd postponed. Cider and mead had their moments too. In apple-rich regions, villagers pressed the fruit and stored the juice in barrels to bubble away into cider. Mead, honey wine, was older still, a sweet drink tied to wedding feasts and slow afternoons. It required honey, water, yeast, and a willingness to wait while tiny organisms did their invisible work. Wine, though, reigned supreme for much of the elite world. Vineyards stretched across France, Spain, and parts of Italy, their rows tended by workers who may or may not have been paid in liquid form. In northern lands, where grapes soaked in the cold, imported wine became a luxury. Monarchs maintained cellars lined with casks, occasionally forgetting which vintage was supposed to impress visiting dignitaries. There's a report of one royal household producing a wine list so badly organized that guests were served a sour batch once intended for cooking. Even beer had its bureaucrats. Cities like Nuremberg and London employed ale tasters, officials who roamed taverns sampling mugs to ensure quality. It sounds enviable, though the job came with less glamorous tasks like inspecting barrels for rodents or sniffing for spoiled batches. No one writes songs about that part. Brewing also tied itself to religion in ways beyond monasteries. Some saints became unofficial patrons of the trade. Saint Arnold of Soissons, for instance, encouraged people to drink beer instead of water during outbreaks of illness, a practical bit of theology that probably saved lives. Pilgrims toasted him, monks prayed for his intercession over fermenting casks, and taverns occasionally hung his image over the bar, a medieval equivalent of a 5-star hygiene rating. Meanwhile, in the same centuries, Royal households continued their quiet parade of eccentricities. Take Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, who preferred wine so much that courtiers developed strategies for approaching him at different stages of his daily consumption. Or Philip the Good of Burgundy, who threw feasts so extravagant they included entremet, decorative dishes like pies containing live birds, which sometimes escape mid-banquet. Nothing says refinement quite like a flustered guest ducking under the tablecloth to avoid a startled pheasant. Even ordinary taverns leaned theatrical. A bustling inn might hang a wooden sign carved with a bear, a ship, or a slightly abstract goose. Inside, patrons sat on benches around scarred tables, their talk muffled by smoke from the hearth. A traveling merchant swapped tales with a miller. A weary pilgrim dozed near the fire. Above them, beams blackened with age creaked gently, and in a corner, an innkeeper's dog judged everyone with impartial patience. The social side of drinking was more complex than it appears from a modern pint glass. Alehouses served as unofficial post offices, gossip hubs, and job markets. Farmers hired help over mugs. Travelers swapped news of distant fairs. Even small villages supported at least one public house, though its public often meant the landlord's front room, cleared of laundry when customers arrived. Not every drinking story was merry. There were regulations about closing hours, fights over unpaid tabs, and the occasional moral panic about excess. Preachers warned against drunkenness, while local councils fined innkeepers for letting things get too rowdy. Still, the line between convivial and catastrophic was as blurred then as it is now. Moving away from mugs, let's drift toward a different corner of daily life. Clothing. A medieval wardrobe, even for a modest household, involved layers. Linen shirts or shifts formed the base. Over these came tunics, gowns, or hose, depending on gender and climate. Wealthier folk added fur-lined garments in winter, sometimes dyed in eye-watering shades to prove they could afford the pigment. Sumptuary laws, those oddly fussy rules about who could wear what, tried to keep people in their place, though enforcement was spotty. A bold merchant might risk a fine just to flash crimson sleeves at market. Shoes evolved too. The pointed styles of the 14th century grew so long they required stitching to the knee like rebellious shoelaces with ambitions. Church leaders muttered that the fashion was sinful, though it's unclear whether their concern was moral decay or the hazard of tripping during processions. Homes, meanwhile, smelled faintly of rushes and hearth smoke. Floors were strewn with straw or herbs to absorb spills and mask less pleasant scents. Windows, if present, were small and often covered with oiled cloth instead of glass. Furniture remained simple. Stools, benches, a sturdy chest. Beds ranged from grand canopies with carved posts to humble pallets stuffed with straw, where families sometimes slept side by side, conversation tapering off as embers faded. Leisure looked modest next to royal feasts, but still found room in common schedules. Storytelling, music, and seasonal games dotted the calendar. May Day dances, harvest festivals, and winter mumming plays gave people a break from plowing or spinning. Some pastimes, like chess, carried a whiff of intellectual prestige. Others, such as Hoodman Blind, a rough ancestor of Blind Man's Bluff, relied mainly on good humor and sturdy shins. The medieval sense of time deserves its own gentle spotlight. Without watches or reliable clocks in every home, people leaned on church bells, sun shadows, and a general awareness of how far the day had wandered. Meals and prayers anchored the rhythm. A smith knew when to stop hammering, not because a bell rang, but because dusk began sneaking through the open door. Law and order, too, were far less uniform than modern systems. A town might have a constable, unpaid and easily distracted, or a night watchman equipped with a lantern and a loud voice. Punishments varied from fines to public shaming, the stocks, a pillory, or a brisk scolding in front of neighbors. Serious crimes sometimes met harsher responses, but day-to-day disputes were often settled with compromise, or a muttered promise to behave. If all this seems oddly soothing, that's partly because distance sands off the sharpest edges. A life of brewing ale, stitching shoes, or tending sheep was full of small worries. Frost, debt, an unexpected royal levy, yet it also offered steady rhythms. People knew the shape of their year, from sowing to harvest, from winter feasts to spring planting. Even their misadventures, like spilled beer or runaway poultry, rarely grew into the sort of catastrophes that keep modern historians up at night. Picture, if you will, a late summer evening. Somewhere in Flanders, a brewer taps a cask, releasing a faint hiss and the promise of something cool and mildly nourishing. Across the yard, children chase each other while a neighbor hums a tune about an improbably gallant rooster. The air smells of yeast, smoke, and ripe hay. Far off, bells call monks to Compline, their silhouettes slipping into the fading light. And there we pause, letting the foam settle and the day drift to a close. Brewing, like history itself, rewards patience, a slow fermentation of stories that, over time, turn into something worth savoring. When we return, we'll wander toward a few more corners of this world, the strange economies of relics, the quiet stubbornness of farmers, and the occasional monarch trying, not always successfully, to banish boredom with new laws. For now, let the thought of a calm tavern and the soft, yeasty hush of a brew house follow you toward sleep. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine, though you're also free to drift off while I keep talking. Tonight we're going to stroll through a few more medieval landscapes, the sort of places where nothing earth-shattering happens, yet everything hums quietly with the patience of centuries. Let's start with something small, but strangely powerful. Relics. Relics were the celebrity memorabilia of the Middle Ages, except instead of autographed photos, they were bits of saints, or items saints had allegedly touched, or sometimes things only rumored to have been near them. Bones, hair, scraps of cloth, even a saint's favorite comb, all candidates for veneration. Churches displayed them in ornate reliquaries, glittering little boxes that made up for the fact that the contents were usually less glamorous. Pilgrims flocked to see these treasures. They trudged for days to stand in a line, peer at a sliver of wood said to come from the true cross, and leave a few coins for maintenance. Some relics were undeniably odd. One abbey swore it owned a feather from the Archangel Gabriel. Another claimed to house the milk of the Virgin Mary, kept in a crystal vial that miraculously never spoiled. Skeptics raised eyebrows, but most people preferred not to poke too hard. It seemed impolite to interrogate holiness. The business around relics could get inventive. There were traveling salesmen offering certified fragments of holy robes, as though saints ran a mail order catalog. Sometimes several churches claimed the exact same artifact, which was awkward if anyone compared notes. Yet relics served a purpose beyond profit. They made the invisible world tangible. A farmer who had spent the week wrestling with stubborn oxen could kneel before a jeweled box and feel that maybe, just maybe, life was more than muddy boots and aching shoulders. Speaking of farmers, they deserve a patient look. Medieval agriculture wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steadiness is underrated. Fields stretched in long, narrow strips, each belonging to a different household. That arrangement meant neighbors worked side by side, which was practical for borrowing tools and inconvenient for avoiding gossip. Crop rotation followed a rhythm. Wheat, then beans or peas, then a year left fallow. It kept the soil alive and gave farmers a chance to catch their breath, though not for long, because weeds never observed the calendar. Oxen were the tractors of their day, sturdy, slow, and prone to staring blankly at anyone urging them forward. Horses could plow faster, but they required better feed, so only wealthier peasants or landlords used them. Plowing was social as much as physical. One person guided the team while another managed the plow itself, and both exchanged commentary about weather, rumors, and whose turn it was to fetch ale. Harvest season brought a brief sense of pageantry. Villages worked together, scythes flashing under a pale sun. Sheaves of grain stood in neat rows, like little congregations waiting for a sermon. After the last bundle was tied, someone might lift a decorated harvest doll, woven from the final stocks, and everyone would pretend the upcoming winter wasn't already tapping at the door. Markets stitched rural and urban life together. Weekly gatherings filled squares with baskets of onions, bolts of rough cloth, barrels of herring, and the faint whiff of cheese nearing its twilight years. Buyers tested bread for freshness by breaking it, though a discreet sniff often followed. Sellers shouted prices over the hum of chatter. A good cry could carry across the square and drown out a rival's pitch. Street musicians threaded through the crowd, hoping their tunes might loosen a few extra pennies. Town councils sometimes regulated market behavior with impressive specificity. Fines awaited anyone caught watering down wine, selling meat of doubtful aroma, or engaging in fistfights near the butter stall. Bakers, in particular, faced scrutiny. Loaves were weighed to ensure they met legal standards. If a baker cheated, they risked public humiliation, or worse, being ordered to provide an extra loaf free to every customer that week. Thus the baker's dozen. Better to over-deliver than stand in the pillory. Meanwhile, royalty continued their habit of legislating boredom away. Kings and queens often issued decrees about things that clearly irritated them. Excessive gambling, overly colorful clothing, or, in one memorable case, the playing of football in city streets. The game wasn't today's carefully refereed sport, but a chaotic scrum that left windows smashed and tempers frayed. Bans rarely worked, which only confirmed for rulers that their subjects were stubborn beyond redemption. Monarchs also obsessed over hunting rights. Forests were valuable, not just for timber but for the deer that wandered within. Laws drew sharp lines between who could chase which animal and on what day. A peasant caught with a rabbit might plead hunger. An unlucky one caught with a stag could face fines, or worse, a lecture about royal prerogative. Some kings even had their foresters patrol with horns, sounding alerts whenever someone looked suspiciously interested in venison. Domestic animals had their own quiet history. Cats earned a place in barns for their mouse-catching skills, though suspicion occasionally shadowed them thanks to superstition. Dogs worked as guardians or hunting partners, depending on breed and household wealth. Chickens, ever pragmatic, offered eggs and the occasional excuse for a small celebration when one produced an unusually large specimen. Inside houses, daily rhythms kept people anchored. Morning meant rekindling embers from last night's fire. Breakfast might be a hunk of bread dipped in ale, or, if luck allowed, a wedge of cheese. Children fetched water, cautiously balancing wooden buckets. Women spun wool or flax, their fingers coaxing thread from soft bundles while neighbors compared notes on whose pig had escaped this week. Men repaired tools or walked fields, occasionally stopping to admire or grumble about the sky. Evenings invited everyone back to a shared hearth. Meals were simple, pottage thick with vegetables, perhaps a slice of salted meat if winter stores held. Stories slipped into the air, some familiar, some newly invented to keep younger listeners quiet. Candles flickered low, casting shadows on rough-hewn beams. Someone might hum a tune that wandered nowhere in particular, like history itself. Amid all this steadiness, the church remained a constant backdrop. Bells marked the hours, and festivals broke up the year with processions, feasts, or fasts. Saints' days sprinkled calendars like quiet punctuation. Lent tightened menus. Easter opened them again. A wedding meant dancing. A funeral meant measured steps behind a bier. Life and faith were not separate lanes, but a single cobbled street where everyone walked together. Slowly, let's pause by one more small corner. Medieval remedies. Apothecaries offered dried herbs, powdered minerals, and the occasional substance that would alarm a modern pharmacist. Recipes promised to cure headaches, toothaches, or an unfortunate tendency to faint during sermons. Some treatments worked. Mint eased stomachs. Willow bark soothed pain. Others were mostly an excuse to drink spiced wine under medical supervision. Leeching, bleeding, and mysterious ointments made from animal fat all claimed their share of respectability. Royal patients were not immune to odd cures. A nervous sovereign might be advised to sleep with a gemstone under the pillow, or to sip broth in which gold leaf had been thoughtfully stirred. Whether these treatments calmed symptoms or simply distracted from them is hard to say. Either way, courtiers dutifully praised their effectiveness. As night falls in our imaginary landscape, picture a small village winding down. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. Somewhere, a brewer checks tomorrow's mash, stirring gently as if encouraging good dreams. Across the square, an innkeeper shutters his windows, tucking the day away. And in a manor a few miles off, a slightly perplexed lord drafts a rule banning something that will be gleefully ignored by breakfast. History rarely shouts from these corners. It murmurs through the clink of cups, the scrape of hose, the faint scent of herbs drying above a hearth. It's in the steady patience of people who never expected to be remembered, but built the scaffolding that supported the louder stories. So as you rest, let that soft continuity settle around you. The past wasn't all grand battles or glittering banquets. Much of it was just people keeping fires alive, tending fields, sharing mugs of ale, and trying to make sense of rules they never asked for. There's something quietly reassuring about that, a reminder that beneath every royal decree or saintly legend, someone still had to sweep the floor, mend the roof, And make sure the beer didn't boil over. Sleep well, if that's where you're headed. And if you're still awake, don't worry. We've more slow wanderings ahead, full of worn cobblestones and patient faces, waiting to be unrolled like an old map.